I mean, it's pretty simple in principle, but it's I don't know, it's kind of long-winded, and I'm not sure if I'll do Professor Patnaik justice in
Well, it doesn't
explaining it.
matter. I'm sure.
It's okay.
Hopefully I don't embarrass myself on this recording, but all right, thank you everyone
Very, very good. It's just, I'm just saying record it just because some people are not here that want
might
to
want to
but are
catch up.
not able
Of
to.
course, no problem. Okay. So essentially, Miss Surinder, I kind of was looking into the video that you sent. It was a 25-minute long video where Professor Patnaik was explaining the link between neoliberalism and how it opens kind of the forum or the ground or the political arena to neo-fascism. And I found like a long 1 hour long explanation on YouTube, and I'm just gonna attempt to summarize that. And I've made a few notes, but essentially the gist of it is there's a very kind of clear link between neoliberal policies or a neoliberal regime and neo-fascism, and essentially, neoliberalist policies prioritize market deregulation, privatization, and austerity. And what that has done is it's kind of created these conditions that are ripe for demagogues and people in fascist organizations to set up shop and kind of vie for the attention and the kind of allegiance of just the general public. And the main kind of crux of the argument is that social and economic inequalities that plague the people, just people in general, especially the working class, that's predominantly who I mean by people, or the parties of interest. So the working class being plagued by issues of inequality, social inequality, economic inequalities, is what the fascist organization latches onto. And they try to, essentially, their tactics are to portray themselves as being, of kind of a relatable representation of the people. They relate to people's frustrations and anger and discontentment with the current organization of society because of neoliberal policies, and they especially kind of tap into people's, I guess, dark thoughts and bigotry by highlighting minorities as being the cause of these issues, these economic and political issues that people are facing. And what Professor Patnaik highlights as well is that even though fascist forces try to highlight neoliberalism as being the problem, the reality is it's corporate finance and the globalized financial system that neoliberalism has fostered and created and has established. This kind of nexus of corporate private finance is actually what props up fascist organizations themselves. So ironically, we have the fascist organizations telling people that, oh yes, the current government is terrible, it's horrible, it's absolutely inefficient, but in reality, they're the ones being propped up by the globalized finance system. So yeah, essentially that's just the gist of it. And I am going to go back to my notes and go to the kind of long-winded explanations he gives on how unemployment and, I guess, inefficiencies in the economy lead to discontentment in people that, the fascists then kind of exploit to regain control. Yeah. So we have neoliberal economic policies prioritizing privatization. However, after post-World War II, what we see is that um, there was more of a statist regime taking hold. So you see all these governments around the world employing a lot of state intervention and a lot of protectionism to help the economies rebuild after the tumultuous period of war and so on. However, in, I guess, the backdrop of this development, we see the United States becoming a neoliberal power. And what that means is, sorry, not neoliberal power. We see the United States becoming, like, positioning itself as a world, like a global power, or like a spokesperson um, for the world. And then it builds its own allegiance with, I guess, other Western countries. And then you have things like you have entities like, you know, the NATO and then the G8 and all those um, organizations. And then we see that the neoliberal kind of way in which the US organizes itself is what emerges at the top. And so, based on the system and the power and kind of interlinking of other countries with the US, everyone just kind of has to acquiesce to this way of organizing, you know, global affairs. So a globalized financial system is established. And what that means is, you know, finance travels freely across borders from country to country. And essentially, every single country is vying for investment, for capital to be established, you know, within their national boundaries to generate opportunities, economic opportunities, and so on, employment, and so on. So, as the news puts it, every country is very wary of investor sentiments and basically the whims of globalized finance. So Professor Patnaik then highlights that democracy is therefore undermined because now economic policies are tailored to demands and caprices and whims of investors. And democracy is no longer about the sovereignty of people, but is replaced by the sovereignty of globalized finance. So that's why we see, I guess, the phenomenon of governments coming into power, promising many things, many policies, many kind of rules, laws, legislations that are pro-people, but then they come into power and then you see them renege on a lot of these policies. So Professor Benai basically highlights that, you know, this is not necessarily a malicious kind of motive of the government, but instead could just be because governments are essentially in the present day tied into this whirlpool of globalized finance, and essentially democracy is dictated by that. So then he also discusses what the implications would be if a country were to remove itself from the whirlpool of globalized finance and choose pro-people policies against the wishes of investors. And you see, I guess, isolationist countries like, you know, I guess Cuba and North Korea, and I guess countries with more left-wing like governments, such as South American countries, kind of pursue a route like this. And you see the repercussions of that would be, firstly, transactional costs. Your capital and investment just kind of leaves and leaks out of the country because you're no longer following the whims of finance. You're no longer privatizing everything and creating legislative conditions that accommodate the private sector. So then financial crises ensue because your investment capital are just exiting from the country. And another implication of this is, you have the neoliberal police force, as I'd like to put it. You have the threat of sanctions from the West, from the Western countries that have interest in your country, and all of a sudden, you're closing your borders, you're not kind of dancing to the tune of global finance. And then what that means is, countries like the US put up sanctions, trade is blocked with other countries, and then that cripples the economies even further. So Professor Patnaik basically just highlights these points to show the interdependence of the economy, of the global economy of every single country in the world on just the network of globalized finance. So after that, he then goes and highlights that the contrast between he basically highlights statist regimes of the past, and I guess the degree of state intervention post World War II, and how the offshoot of that was that some interests of other classes other than the ruling class of the bourgeoisie, or basically the corporate finance oligopoly. So other classes were kind of, cared for and listened to during the statist regimes post World War II. So you saw state protectionism, you saw subsidization of fledgling industries and things like that, that essentially would protect the the interests of petty producers. You see some policies protecting the interests of peasants and also the working class from the wholesale degradation of capital. But however, if you contrast that to the present day, where you see like a fully neoliberal economic regime, you see the policies as being absolutely isolated from all the other classes, and you just see the interests of the corporate financial oligarchy being promoted domestically. So essentially, there's a huge crisis of petty production, which means that all these, people, workers or labor market candidates engaging in petty production were removed from that and were forced to either become laborers, and then kind of they endured the process of pauperization, or they had to migrate to towns and other urban dwellings in search for jobs. And what that means is the reserve army of labor, which is a Marxist concept, which I hope everyone here is familiar with. So the reserve army of labor swells, and it increases uncontrollably, and it's especially concentrated within third world countries. And another thing that was highlighted was that under capitalism, and again, neoliberal policies always want to encourage, trade and the free flowing of capital and investments and so on. And that also includes ensuring that the pace of technological progress is uninhibited, because competition is key. You're always competing to have competitive advantage in through trade and so on, and maintain your balance of payments. So under capitalism, when you have technological progress that's uninhibited, that means that you're going to have uninhibited labor displacement, because under capitalism, technological progress takes on the form of labor displacement. So petty producers moving to towns has negative implications, because there'll essentially be like a saturation of workers just forming a large kind of pool of, I guess, replaceable labor resources that the capitalists can then use and replace as and when needed. So, so then essentially the next point that's highlighted is the relocation of industry from the first world to third world countries means that there's high GDP growth rates, but then at the same time, there's increasing labor productivity because of the uninhibited technological progress or the innovation. So if you try to calculate employment growth through the formula of GDP growth rate minus labor productivity growth rate, that essentially means that employment growth is falling or not increasing at all under the neoliberal economic regime, because you see both the GDP growth rate increasing in tandem with labor productivity. So there essentially are minimal or no employment opportunities. So you have a combination of a swelling reserve army of labor as well as low employment growth, which is a recipe for disaster, and the disaster being absolute poverty. So, of course, so there's essentially an increase in the magnitude of absolute poverty relative to the population, as I said, due to the rising reserve army of labor, particularly in third world, and then you also have low employment growth. So that essentially sets the stage, explaining the kind of inefficiencies of the neoliberal regime and the kind of foundational inequality between the top 1 or 10% of the surplus holders or the bourgeoisie class in a country, and I guess the rest of the working class or the people or the labor market resources that are basically part of the reserve army of labor. So that's essentially exploited by, I guess, as I mentioned, demagogues and political entities that try to build a cult of personality, such as you see, I guess, in the US, candidates such as Donald Trump, and then you see in Brazil we had Jair Bolsonaro, a far-right president of Brazil, and also now in India we see Narendra Modi as well. So to dive into this example a bit deeper, so in India, just briefly, all the neoliberal economic policies were linked with a rise in Hindu nationalism. So Modi's government, of course, had promoted policies and rhetoric that marginalized Muslim and other minority communities, and that essentially exacerbated social division and unrest. And that essentially is charting towards very closely towards fascism, neo-fascism. So again, there's like a blend again of neoliberalism and ethno-nationalism, and of course a healthy mix of authoritarianism. And then, as I mentioned about Jair Bolsonaro's government, so again, you see the trend of neoliberal policies, and that kind of set the stage for him to come into power. He essentially took advantage of the existing scenario in Brazil, where there were plenty of neoliberal reforms such as privatization and austerity measures. And what he did was he essentially pandered to those kind of to that unrest and dissatisfaction from the people, and then came into power. In addition to that pandering, he came into power by employing very strong rhetoric against marginalized communities and minorities as well. So that, again, there's like a very similar trend to what I just explained in the India example. And there's further examples, of course, in Hungary, in Poland, in France, in Germany as well with the AfD, and of course in the US with Donald Trump as well. But yeah, essentially, I'm very conscious that I've been rambling for a while, and I'm very conscious that it doesn't make sense to people. So if we could start in and engage in like a kind of like a two-way discussion, and maybe I could bring up some other points, that would be good.
Okay, thank you, Malika, for making a good summary of the points. Let's give her a clap.
Thank you.
Good effort, great effort, actually.
That was so difficult. My notes are so disorganized.
No, that's
Yes,
fine.
your first time attempting to make a presentation to senior people. So it is a
Yeah, I
valiant
was really
effort.
scared.
It is courageous. It's
Thank you.
actually a very good effort.
Oh, thank you.
Hope
But
to
can I
see
say
you
one more
again.
thing?
Yes.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
I found Professor Patnaik's video really interesting, like his theory and his rationale really interesting because I read this book previously, briefly, and this is How Democracies Die by some Harvard guys.
Yeah.
And what they say in this is they essentially remove the blame or the kind of like blame, the accusatory finger from the neoliberal regime or the neoliberal parties or like the centrist parties completely, and they try to make it look like fascist organizations or parties coming to power is a completely independent and unrelated thing to kind of like centrist, like center right parties, currently in power. And they actually kind of well, not glorify, but I don't know what the word is, but they kind of try to make center right or centrist parties look like the hero in this book, and they try to say that, oh, despite conflicting ideologies, such as in the case of, I guess there's some sort of election in Belgium and some sort of election outcome in Finland as well. The center right or the centrist party had to actually collaborate with the left wing party to oust a far right fascist group from coming into power. So I find it really interesting how this book completely like eliminates the link between
Yes, maybe you can make a presentation later.
yeah, maybe, but yeah, I just found the contrasting
Have you got the
perspective.
PDF version of that book?
No, but I can find one on Library Genesis because they have all the free books on it.
Which book? Where? Which site?
There's a website called Library Genesis, which has like, I don't think it's very legal, but apparently it has like a lot of academic papers and books with the PDF version free on there.
Library Genesis.
Yeah, Library Genesis.
Okay.
Yeah. See, I think students use it
Okay,
a lot.
let's start a discussion. Paul.
Hi there.
Lake's got his hand up as well.
You want to go first, Lek?
Lake, yeah.
Okay.
Paul.
Shall I go first?
Paul.
Okay, so well, thank you for that. You've actually raised quite a few interesting questions.
We'll be able to answer them.
No. I mean, your presentation contains a number of issues, some of which are contentious.
Yeah.
So a part of the problem is we use the word neo-fascist in a rather undefined way. So one of the things we need to clarify is what we mean by neo-fascism, i.e. what is fascism in the first place? Not to be confused with far-right authoritarian regimes which have characteristics mimicking fascism. In other words, they share some things in common. but the fact that you share things in common doesn't make it therefore fascist. So I suggest we explore what we mean by fascism, because it's been deeply explored for the past 50 years, and there is a precise definition there, which we can come back to. The other connection is between neoliberalism and globalization and all its attendant features, which you described, such as endemic structural inequality, poverty, that sort of thing, privatization. Historically, there's no actual necessary connection between that and the emergence of fascism, so that needs exploring. It may be a feature of certain situations as today, but it doesn't have to be a necessary feature of fascism. And there are a number of other related issues which we could perhaps begin. So I'd be interested to know what they understand by fascism, because until we know what we mean by that, then it's difficult to debate the structure of what you're discussing. Yeah.
Paul, we had the discussion before on fascism. I know you presented a couple of papers, didn't you, before?
Yeah.
Could you just refresh our memories about what the tenets of fascism were, and then if we could just leave it there, and then.
Okay. Yeah. Right. So nothing which has been said is contradictory here. Just for it needs clarification. So theoreticians talk about to make this distinction between fascism proper and movements and activities, parties and states which are nasty, right-wing and officious and brutal. Make that distinction between that sort of state and what fascism is important, because not all those states are fascist. They're just nasty places to be. So there's something called the fascist minimum, which must be, as it were, demonstrated to talk about a fascist system, a fascist government, a fascist state, or a fascist movement. All these things are relevant to what's just been said, as Malika said. But so the fascist minimum is what's called palingenesis, which means a rebirth. So all fascist movements, so properly called, believe that once upon a time, in some mystical past, there's a great nation based upon ethnicity, typically. So it's very ethno-nationalistic.
Paul, can you be a little louder? Come closer to the speaker. Okay. Yeah.
People hear me?
Yeah.
So palingenesis is a term used to describe the ideal type fascist setup, which means, so it's an ideology. And what it means is that fascists believe that there was once upon a time a great race or nation or collectivity in the distant past, and it was kind of a glorious era. And over a period of time, with the emergence of capitalism in particular, those glorious times, those idyllic past glories, have been somehow perverted, undermined, destroyed, for a variety of means. To come back to that. And their job is to rebuild that glorious past, to be reborn, to be reborn as a nation, to be purified as a nation, to re-establish a glorious future. So if you take the classic archetypical fascist state, which was Nazi Germany, it's believed there's once an Aryan race which was superior to the rest of the world, it was more civilized, more sophisticated. And over a period of time, this Aryan race was undermined by infiltration, by intermarriage, what they call miscegenation, by outside influences, by hostile enemies within and without. And their job is to purge their society of such people and purge their enemies to be reborn as a great nation. So if you don't have that present in any fascist ideology, then it's not really fascist. You have things which are similar. So we talk about Modi. He talks about a great Hindutva past, which has been a great era, which has been destroyed by the invasion of Muslims and other undesirables. And his job is, as a fascist party, is to remove these impurities from the body politic, so that India can be reborn again as a great Hindu nation. We see the same thing in Israel. Zionism believes there's once a great Jewish race, which was exiled and kicked out, and they are returning to claim their inheritance. And they have an absolute right to kick out Palestinians. So linked to fascism are notions of ethnic cleansing and notions of genocide.
Yeah.
Now, how that connects up with neoliberalism is another story. The point to bear in mind historically is that these fascist movements have attracted not the working classes, as is often claimed. The natural demographic for fascist movements are the lower middle class. And so lower middle classes, the petty bourgeoisie, in Marxist terms, who has provided the fodder for fascist movement. So we can perhaps come back to class analysis in fascism, another interesting dimension. So I'll stop there, just some couple of thoughts about definitions. Yeah.
From the example that you mentioned about Nazi Germany, I kind of gauged that there were about like 3 elements that make up the whole definition of fascism. So it's the nationalist ideology. Actually, you mentioned ethno-nationalist ideology, and then plus a combination of authoritarianism, and then this kind of centralized, like totalitarian governments that just kind of, everything's like there's like a central like state pillar that just kind of, just has control of everything. So it just has like those 3 elements of fascism.
So what's interesting in that particular analysis you just presented is that, for example, in Nazi Germany, a capitalist class was subservient to the political class. The Nazi Party controlled capitalists in Germany, but they made a fortune out of the war because there's what's called corporatism. But no, they served the fascist state and not vice versa. But the analysis which says that fascism arises out of neoliberalism, et cetera, is only, it's not entirely true historically. So this notion that and the same has happened with Mussolini in Italy, is that the fascist party of Italy, the very first fascist party in the 20th century, controlled the economic sphere. So the capitalists made lots of money out of the process. It suited them, but the point is they didn't control the state, is vice versa. So to the detriment sometimes of their war efforts, for example. So this relationship between fascism and capitalism is quite complex, and it's not always the case that capitalists control and create fascism. That's not entirely true historically.
I think it kind of explains just neo-fascism, because like if you see, well, I'm just going to talk about Trump because of my confirmation bias for the theory. If you see, he has like a lot of like, in addition to being a very like a billionaire himself, he has a lot of corporate backing, despite his basically extremist views. And I think his Professor Patnaik's theory just kind of says that, you know, you see a resurgence of the vestiges of the fascism, like the kind of strain of fascism we saw in the 1930s, but it's not, and it never will be as strong or as kind of momentous as back then. And the reason why you see it kind of popping up at present is because the neoliberal regime wants to distract people from questioning what's actually wrong with the current kind of like, I guess, neoliberal economic policies. And they can perfectly distract them by bringing, you know, fascists on the fringes of society and like pulling them into the center stage in the political arena. So I think that's what he's saying to describe the kind of phenomenon that's happening at present. I don't know to what degree you agree.
I thought the main point that comes out in both the speakers is the lack of working class unity. And
Yeah, sure.
yeah. So one thing that Professor Patnaik says is that deficit financing, which has now become something like a common sense now, because remember Liz Truss budget was a failure because she didn't account for how she will raise the money. So when the Keynesian era dominated, it was all right. You show the expenditure and you don't have to show how you are going to raise the money by for this particular expenditure. Liz Truss's budget was a failure because she didn't account for it, how she is going to raise the money.
What's
So,
that got to do with fascism? Sorry.
pardon?
What's that got to do with fascism?
What he's saying is that this neoliberal policies, the earlier policy, Keynesian policy, and it is true also, capitalism cannot survive without government intervention. So, which delegitimizes capitalism.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if capitalism has to be saved from time and time again, then why not do everything? The state do it. So this is one of his arguments.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
the state's activity has to be proved. It is very harmful to the society. So this fiscal deficit is therefore considered a very, very harmful thing. Yeah, that is what I said. The less of the state. Now,
Thomas, the spell for lift.
Sorry. Can we chair this properly? Lake
Yeah.
has his hand up, and then
Yeah.
I'd like to say
Yeah.
something as well.
Okay, I didn't see any hands up. You should put up
Lake
a
did
hand.
have his hand up, I think.
Up a
Yeah,
thumbs up.
I don't see it
Thumbs
here. You put the hand like this. Okay.
I have done, and anyway, thank you, Suren. Please don't, Malika, don't please apologize for rambling on. That was a wonderful presentation, and it was really, really good. And I just want to put my oar in and saying, you know, that I think what I'm struggling with is that there is very little said about the forces that drive neoliberalism, you know, and neo-fascism. You know, I know we have a contentious idea about what is neo-fascism, but neoliberalism is actually a very corporate capitalist driven ideology, and and I think somewhere along the line we tend to lose that grasp of that, I think. And I'm not too sure whether fascism is, obviously it has many facets, but nationalism is one facet. But even nationalism is driven by greed for control, a greed for power, and I think I find that is very often missing in these discussions. That it is at the end of it all, those people who are leading the neoliberal policies and neo-fascist policies, their sole purpose is to dominate and control the society, at the expense of the working people, and that does, when we start calling it neoliberalism and neo-fascism, I feel that we are sort of whitewashing or watershedding, or I don't know the word. We're just sort of we're watering it down,
Diluting it.
Yeah, yeah. And that's one point. The other point I wanted to raise with you guys was, neo-fascism is a neoliberalism. It's been there since the 90s, maybe late 80s. And what effect do you think there is on such policies, having changed from a multipolar world to a unipolar world and vice versa?
Yeah, I'm quite keen on knowing that myself. I have a lot of holes in my knowledge about the history before World War II. And yeah, no, absolutely. I'm keen on knowing that myself. But actually on your previous point about watering down, I guess the drive that capitalists have to just kind of establish control over, I guess, the flow of investment and finance and money and just politics, etc. I probably did Professor Patnaik some injustice in explaining it, because he actually does explain that all, like, there's a hegemony of global finance on the world, and all the governments around the world are essentially just kind of trapped in like some sort of mechanism that just caters to it. And he goes and he essentially explains that there's like an overproduction crisis of capitalism, and that's where things like the fiscal deficit and other sorts of policies, that's where those come into play to kind of compensate for that overproduction. And it's all really complicated. And I didn't really explain it very well, but he does kind of explain that mechanism. Just kind of answer your first kind of.
I think he says that the basic problem is with the capitalism, and fascism is like a distraction.
Yeah,
But
that's
having said
essentially
that,
what.
fascism has got its own life. It
I
has
think what he's
become,
saying is that, we did read his book, or we did have a discussion on his book called The Theory of Imperialism.
Mhm.
People remember? I think Saif introduced it. So in that book, what they were saying was that whereas Lenin thought that imperialism was the last stage of capitalism, Patnaik has argued that it's actually the first stage of imperialism, because capitalism, because without imperialism, without the exploitation from slavery, from the exploitation of India and the colonized world, there would not have been any capitalism in Europe. So that's their starting point, and that surplus accumulation of surplus value and surplus itself continues to go on today, and now it's called globalization or neoliberalism, which is globalization as a spread, dispersal of neoliberal policies. So from that, I think they then go on to say that because that relationship still continues, the Western world is, there's sort of a labor aristocracy going on, whereas where the working classes of the West are actually the labor aristocracy, and the working classes of the imperialized world, or the post-colonized world, continue to be the sort of, I think there's the price takers. I think there's something called the price takers, that basically they accept what they get given. Yeah, they have no power to negotiate because those world institutions like the World Bank and everything else actually control what the colonized world, or the third world, or the global south, or whatever you want to call it, those institutions are controlling every step of the strategies that those countries want to take. So, and in that process, then, because the third world is overexploited, its class is in poverty, its working classes are left in poverty, and those that want to run, the politicians, the other capitalists, they are the rulers of, they have control and power. But also that in those countries, whereas before you didn't have big rich capitalists, before the whole third world was sort of poor. Now there is also, because of the neoliberal policies and the lack of state control, whereas relatively before there was more state control, but within neoliberalism there is no state control over its resources. Those previously state-owned resources have been sold off, and it's the capitalist classes of the third world countries that have become the new rich. Yeah, and the states, the nation states of the third world countries, are both acting in to protect its own capitalist classes and elite classes, as well as the international corporate sector as well. So yeah, it's the reserve army of labor. It's always been the reserve army of labor, and it continues to be so. And because of this overexploitation, there is obviously a need to control those classes, and that's where the need for authoritarian comes in, fascistic elements come in. So I think in a nutshell, that's my understanding of what Patnaik is saying and what's new about his thesis. And then he also goes on to say that he doesn't call it neo-fascist, he just calls it fascist, because he says that that India is becoming a fascist country, as are many third world countries, and that we don't have to worry about, is it the same sort of fascism as we've had in Germany and elsewhere, because it can be, why does fascism always have to be the same as it was in Germany? And what he says is that the core sort of principles of fascism, the ones that we've mentioned, are evident in India. The only difference is that whereas, say in Germany, it was the state doing the scapegoating and ethnic cleansing, now that role has been given to the working classes themselves, or classes within the nation itself. So the state's not doing that, but there are classes within those states that are doing that for the state, as it were.
Now, Lotika has joined.
Yeah.
Lotika, you wanted to raise the hand? Ah, okay.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you. And actually, following on from what Surinder's saying, I also wanted to bring in the World Bank issue, which you did, and its role in sort of what it does in these countries as part of that hierarchy of financial institutions. So it demands for structural adjustment in these in the global South, which is, of course, withdrawal of public services and everything becoming more and more privatized. But here, I just want to actually also talk. You mentioned about the that the sort of what are they called? The Nova Riche maybe are taking a part of the process. But actually, if you look, people like the Tatas and Birlas were already making money in the British Times. I mean, a lot of the money people like Tatas and all made in the poppy trade itself when the others were all, when the whole poppy thing was going
Sorry,
on.
I think what they're saying is that they didn't control the state, whereas now they control the state.
I disagree there, because if you look at what happened in the Adivasi areas in 2009, the Salwa Judam and the state vigilantism and then the Operation Green Hunt, Salwa Judam was actually financed by Tata. This was written in a report by the Indian government, the first draft of a report called The Unfinished Business of Land Reforms, and it was removed in the final draft, which is on the government website, but the draft report is available elsewhere. And they were definitely already, very much hand in glove. That was already happening.
That's with the globalization, though, isn't it? That's still.
Yeah, because you
The
said that
globalization was
neoliberal
always there. You
policy.
can say the poppy trade was also globalized. It was a globalized
I
trade.
mean, the neoliberal spread.
Yeah, the neoliberal coming in. So yeah, definitely Adani and Ambani on the top, but Tata and all are not very far behind. They are also very much there. So I think it's obviously a gradual process in which the kind of fascist state that we're seeing now, and the one you're describing about, as Professor Patnaik says, has been enabled by what was already happening before. So they were already, Lake wants to come in. I'm fine. I'm done. Yeah. Oh, even Phil wants to.
Paul, oh yeah, Phil.
Yeah.
I go. Okay, so I think the conversation, reinforces a key point for debate, which is the exact relationship between the economy, in this case neoliberalism, and the state or the polity. And as Lex points out, there's no one particular version of fascism. It's always got its own unique characteristics depending upon where it started and where it lives, in which country or state it's actually flourishing. So, but the point is, what is this connection between a fascist? So let's talk about a fascist-controlled state as opposed to a movement. What is the connection between a fascist-controlled state and the economic sphere, in our case, capitalists? And there's always been a kind of strange, ambivalent synthesis. To not grasp this point is to actually subscribe to a total myth. And that total myth is that there was once upon a time a free market with no state involvement. Capitalism, as I think Lech pointed out, capitalism evolved on the back of the state. The state actually fueled capitalism. It gave them contracts. It gave them all sorts of access to money. But there's no such thing as non-state intervention. The state exists to intervene by definition, and historically intervened in behalf of capitalism, hence anti-trade union laws, or those kind of things, and anti-free speech. the state exists to support the economic system. So, and has always done so. There's never been a time when the state's not been a major supporter of capitalism. The two is corporate capitalism. That's why City of London is supported by all British governments. You know, City of London and the state, the United Kingdom, are closely connected. So then that raises the question: what exactly is this connection between fascist states and capitalism? It's quite possible, as in India, to have an alliance between fascists who run the government and a neoliberal world order, but sometimes their interests coincide. Sometimes not. The unique feature of fascism is that, for at least for a moment in time, the polity, the government, the regime, the politicians, the dictators take control of capitalism in its domain, and capitalism then becomes, as it were, subservient to the state for a particular period in time until it collapses. So you could so some people argue that, for example, China is really a kind of a proto-fascist state because capitalism in China is heavily controlled and regulated by the state, and it does, and those capitalists do as they're told. And you've got examples in South America. So this connection between a fascist state, which is a polity, which is a political ideology, and capitalism, which is an economic issue, that connection is crucial. We need to unravel each connection in each particular case.
Okay, Surinder?
Sorry, Lake's come back.
Yeah.
Lake, yeah.
I just want to throw, Sundar, I just want to throw this in. We've been talking about neoliberalism, and we've been talking about neo-fascism. What I think is missing is neo-colonialism. You know,
Yeah.
That I think should be thrown in, and I raise that because I think this whole topic we are talking about started off because of what's happening in Bangladesh, and what is happening in Bangladesh is, I think, this is what led to our discussions today, and Bangladesh is part and parcel of the neo-colonial project. Call it neo-fascist project. I don't know. So I think I just want to throw that in, and because at the end of the day, it is the external forces that uses nationalism, religion, or what have you.
But that's what neoliberalism is. Neoliberalism, or so-called globalization, is the current form of imperialism.
Okay.
It is. It's always, that is an argument. I mean, I wouldn't even question that. Yeah, I've forgotten what I was gonna say something before. I've forgotten it now.
Yeah.
Paul was talking about the links between fascism. What exactly is the link between fascism and neoliberalism? And I think you were going to respond to that.
Yeah, I forgot.
That question. Well, yes.
Paul?
The question becomes: is the link?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Sorry, I remember what I was going to say. Go on, you carry on.
Go ahead. Okay. So this crucial connection between let's call it a fascist state, because fascist states control resources. They control the state. They have a monopoly of power. So fascist movements, those sorts of things, are slightly different. They're not yet in power. So a fascist state and its relationship to its economy and other people's economies is a very important feature. As Lek has just pointed out, it is historically, it's been a feature of all fascist states to colonize. So there's another connection. Every fascist state has an ambition to expand for their own ideological reasons. That's not just true of Nazi Germany or Italy. It's true of India. It's also true of Hungary and Romania, and all those other fascist states which emerged in the 1930s, they all seeking to expand. Some people call Putin a fascist state because he's expanding into Ukraine, for example. So this notion of expansion and colonization of other peoples is part and parcel of fascism, because those other peoples are, by definition, in fascist terms, racially inferior, which permits their extermination. So, and this is another strand of fascism, which goes way back into the 19th century and earlier. Fascism as a concept is linked to the nation, which is a new phenomena, but that nation is also linked then to a racialized structure of society. Once you racialize the world into inferior races, that is the heartbeat of fascism. Fascism always claims that they are superior as a people. They always claim that other peoples are inferior and they ought to be colonized. This is classic fascist language. So wherever you see that language, you're seeing fascism in operation. This close connection between exploitation of other peoples, their ethnic cleansing, their genocide is a fascist phenomena. So wherever you see a genocide taking place, you can be pretty certain someone believes in power. Those being exterminated are inferior. They're using up resources we want, and we get rid of them. So, and as you open up this can of fascist worms, you can see all sorts of connections historically, which also embraces neoliberalism. But the two are actually not simultaneous.
So are you saying that, say, like Israel is fascist?
Absolutely.
And then, so why are you not saying that India could be fascist as well?
Well, it is because it's become so, and it's innate in that kind of ideology. Fascism in India goes back to 1930s. Where fascist movements actually mirrored and aped and copied the Nazi movement, and that's never gone away. But the point is, we now have a government in power, Modi, with his Indivata, which is a form of fascism. It's saying that some peoples are inferior to us. They're a threat to our well-being. They need to be controlled, mistreated. They can be pogromed, and if necessary, they can be cleansed and removed.
Okay, sorry, I thought you were saying that they're not fascist. Sorry.
No, on the contrary, it's an Indian version of fascism. So the next key point is that fascism manifests itself in different ways in different contexts. So we have the Modi's fascism, we have the Zionist fascism, we have the Nazi fascism and the Mussolini fascism, and the other places, especially in South America, where you get elements of it. And this is where right-wing authoritarian regimes, as it were, morph into fascism because they start picking up this racialized, ethnocentric exclusivity, which permits them to actually get rid of people.
Hmm.
Can I pose a question here? That whether it is fascism or nationalism, they're all driven by a greed for power, you know? So
Is it just power or is it profit as well?
well,
Because I think
profit and power are synonymous. I think
Okay.
that they're related.
yeah.
And so these people who want to exercise that power will use tools like nationalism. They will use tools like to exercise power. It is manufacturing consent and building up a fervor, Hinduism and all that kind of. And I think that the root cause of all these things, if I can use that word, is actually exercising dominance.
Then the question arises, dominance for what?
For
And then it comes to
greed.
And then it comes to dominance of distribution of surplus of the society.
Sorry?
Dominance for the distribution of the surplus of the society.
Distribution for the surplus of society.
That is the opposite of yes. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
Well, I don't understand what that means. Domination. What?
What he's saying is that, socialist forces can exercise dominance for the distribution of society. Right. Is that
No,
what
Yeah,
he's
so
saying?
the surplus of society essentially is when you exploit workers, you don't give them, what's due to them in terms of compensating them for their labor, exploit resources, appropriate them disproportionately as a private entity, and so you accumulate that surplus in the 1%, or like the bourgeoisie class accumulates all of that excess surplus from the exploitation and hoards it, just kind of,
yeah.
at their
That
peak
is
in their
that is the that
I
is
think Thomas should explain himself.
yeah. That's what I was saying. That was also Thomas Piketty's point that Professor Patnaik mentions, and Thomas Piketty's point was that in society, R, that is the real rate of interest, should never be greater than G. G is the growth rate of the economy. Now, under the financial system, we have legitimized, and because logically it cannot be, because R, that is real rate of interest in the society, should never be greater than the growth rate of the economy. If the economy grows at 3%, that growth should be reflected in the growth of the real wages, growth of the profit, growth of interest in all those returns to different factors of production. What he says that under the financial system, under neoliberalism, we changed the rules that R is greater. R is the, let's say R. Let's say that, put all these together. R for profit, interest, all those together, and the wages. There are only two returns, wages and R. So if R is greater than G, so whatever economy grows, surplus is created in the society, is taken away, taken away. And then when R is greater, they are taking away even wages share, that share of the wages. That was the point. So if financialization has legitimized this system, that is what the sophisticated point about it.
Yeah, it's hard to explain. And it's funny because at the end of the video, he says that the takeaway from this whole theory is to educate the working class about the appropriation of the surplus in the hand of, like, the capitalists enforced by neoliberal regimes, which thereby kind of, sometimes to distract people from asking essential questions about how the economy is run, they bring in, fascist parties to, again, detract from people asking, why are you taking our wages? Why are you exploiting us? Why are you creating endless profit? And for what purpose? So before people can ask those questions, they say, oh, the Mexicans are stealing your job, the Chinese are stealing your job, etc., etc., marginalizing groups and distracting from the realization, those things. So yeah, that's just essentially his point, and I don't think it's very comprehensive in explaining why fascism keeps kind of cropping up, and sometimes it's not even propped up by the, I guess, capitalist hegemony. So the theory doesn't really explain that part, but yeah, it's a useful theory, useful
Yeah,
exploration.
And then we can
Okay,
wind up.
so
Yeah.
I just want to make a couple of points. Is that you don't have to bring in the word fascism to explain exploitation. Exploitation has been happening before fascism and even today. Without you don't need to use the F word to understand, from a Marxist point of view, to understand exploitation and the impoverishment of workers and all those kind of things we've been talking about. So to conflate the two is kind of a conceptual cul-de-sac. It can, of course, be the case that fascist regimes get into bed with neoliberals, as they do in India, for their own reasons. Now, that's quite possible, but it's not a necessary connection. It's a contingent historical connection in particular cases. The thing I just want to perhaps, I was talking about the fascist inevitable tendency to not just exploit people, but to exterminate them. So capitalism is not interested in exterminating people because they need people to exploit. On the contrary, fascism is set up to exterminate people because they seem to be impure, they seem to be an internal threat, they seem to be subhumans. It's highly racialized. So let me, I don't know if people are familiar with the notion of what's called necropolitics. Political theory talks about how some societies which feature fascist phenomena, some societies have built into the very DNA a necropolitical perspective. That is, they exist and their culture orientates them to killing other people because they're inferior. So there's a vast literature on what's called necropolitics, and there's a famous article written by someone called, I think it's called an African guy, and Denby or something like that, who wrote a brilliant article about 20 years ago. So if you want to, it's worth exploring necropolitics as a conceptual phenomena, which is closely linked to fascism. Fascism, if you want the key feature of fascism, it kills people because they're the wrong sort of person. And neoliberalism kills people for other reasons, not because they're the wrong sort of person, because they get in the way. So this important distinction I keep trying to hammer home about is so important. Otherwise, we don't understand the world. Yeah.
Lotika, and then
I just want to,
Yeah, Lake, come in first, then I'll come.
yeah. I just want to come back on that, Phil, is that you're saying don't confuse exploitation with fascism. But I mean, I think fascism becomes the ultimate tool for exploitation. And I really don't see that that you can actually separate the two. Nationalism, religion, or whatever, and fascism ultimately is the tool to exercise exploitation. So I'm struggling to see why you make that demarcation.
okay, Lotika, and then we can wind up.
No, I've got a question.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, I guess Phil will answer. I'll just very quickly, again, I suppose that there's those distinctions that we're talking of fascisms in different parts. So this idea of the people and as the other and then being killed because they are a distinctively impure group, or you project or you create this idea that they're impure in different ways. Again, I mean, in the context of India, we see from the caste system that certain labor has to be done by certain people. It's not about working class and middle class, really. It is about people from caste being in certain situations to do certain jobs. And who are the Muslims in India? 80% of them are actually converts from the lower caste, the caste and all, and they've always remained at the bottom of society. So the idea of demonizing the Muslim in India is, and what they're doing is not so much about the Muslim actually, but about discouraging the Dalit person to try to get out of the occupational caste system by becoming Muslim, and in which then they may be a genocide. I hope not, but yeah, they may be. But the genocide is actually to keep the system going, and the genocide is also linked to another group, the Adivasis. For them, that is one population they consider surplus, who is outside the caste system and refusing to come into the caste system. Yeah. So just, yeah, those fine. I think they just find a distinctions of that whole thing.
Okay, Surinder.
Yeah, so Paul, you said that there are some societies like the fascist societies that have are based on the desire to kill the impure or whatever, those that are deemed inferior. What is the relationship of that to the necessity of having an industrial reserve army of labor?
Well, this is an interesting question because this is another great myth about this is Marxism of the 19th century, and it's getting pretty outmoded. There's no need these days to have a reserve pool of labour. Marx visualised all these peasants coming to the towns, having lost their lands, and hanging about to be called to work during the boom times, and then they get disposed of. So you get these lumpen proletariat, people who are hanged about to be employed, and causing trouble, that sort of thing, have to be heavily policed. But the truth is, these days, neoliberal capitalism has gone way beyond that, and it has vast populations which are of no use to it whatsoever. The Adivasi, which Lalita's just mentioned, are not part of the reserve pool of labour, but outside the labour system. So one of the problems about neoliberalism, which has to, one of its challenges, is to make sure that the local elites with whom they are in cahoots control these unemployable groups, so that they're marginalised and ideally they got rid of, heavily policed. So the idea that there are reserve pools of labour hanging about in each country is long since gone. Where's just pool of labour in Britain, for example? We have a pool of people who are dispossessed, impoverished, on benefits, will always be on benefits for a variety of reasons. I work with these people in my particular field. They're not reserved pools of labour. This dynamic has changed. So when we start talking about, in Marxist terms, exploitation and that sort of thing, it has to be nuanced, to take into account that concept has been largely made redundant. So
I don't know whether that has actually. I'm not sure whether I would agree totally.
that's
In
not true.
terms of the international division of labor, or not division, but international order, so third world countries are still the industrial reserves, aren't they? Because that's where the manufacturers gone, but it's
Yeah.
not coming back. But so I think historically, at least, that has been the case. But also, what I wanted to was thinking about was Germany itself. I suspect the Jews weren't the industrial reserves there anyway. But what would have been its logic in terms of drawing upon and having the necessity to have an industrial reserve?
I missed your question. What's the necessity, did you say?
In Germany, when they did slaughter the Jews,
Yeah.
what would their logic have been in terms of thinking about the necessity to have a reserve labor force?
A couple of points.
Mm.
Jews slaughtered by the Nazis were not actually in Germany, a very small proportion. The Jews massacred by the Nazis was in Eastern Central Europe, who are deemed to be a subgroup, they called Untermenschen, and they were just happy to slaughter them. Many of whom were Jewish, of course, because that's the old Jewish heartlands. But many other people were slaughtered, and the Slavs, which were conquered, were going to be the slaves of Germans. So become a kind of a helot class, a slave class, had Hitler triumphed. But of course in Germany, what we called very reserved pool of labour were of course immigrants, guest workers.